despite all of the the plain inequalities that exist. Which situation is better? And I just think that the progress that has been made towards those ideals uh, is undeniable. But that doesn't mean that you then say, well, but everything's great, and let's not worry about existing injustices. What you do as a liberal is you say, yes, we're still not fully living up to those ideals, and so we need to go ahead and correct them. But our society is correctable, and we can use policy and politics to make changes to make things better.
It is my privilege to welcome to Forward political science PhD from Harvard University, senior fellow at Stanford now, and the author of 10 books, including his latest Liberalism and Its Discontents, Francis Fukuyama, technically. Welcome, Frank. How are you?
Very good, Andrew. Thanks very much for having me on.
It's a pleasure. I quoted you in my last book. I've been an admirer of yours intellectually for a long time, but in my last book, I quoted you as saying America is in danger of becoming what you called a vetocracy, which is that I can't do anything, but I can keep you from doing anything.
Right. Yeah. So political scientists talk about political systems and how they differ from one another from country to country in terms of how many veto points there are. That is to say, these blocking provisions in constitutions and in law that allow people to stop things, but not necessarily to do positive things. And the United States has a lot more than other democracies. And I think we've seen our system kind of freeze up over the last few years because of them.
Yeah, we have more choke points, as you pointed out in some of your earlier books. And I get the sense that the focus of your thinking has shifted over time. There was a period when liberalism, classical liberalism, seemed ascendant in the world X number of years ago, and then it has essentially been in decline for the last number of years. Is that fair to say? And when do you think that decline started?
Yeah, I think that it really picked up steam in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. And it was attacked from both the right and the left. The one from the right is one we're pretty familiar with. You have all these populist nationalist politicians all over the world, from Viktor Orban in Hungary to Donald Trump in this country, who basically are not liberal. And by liberal, I don't mean liberal in the American sense of progressive or left of center. I mean it in a classical sense where individual rights, equal individual rights, are protected by a rule of law and by constitutional checks and balances. And the common characteristic of these populists is that they admire strongmen that aren't constrained by these kinds of checks and balances. And that's why I think a lot of them actually admire Vladimir Putin, because he's a kind of archetype of a strongman who doesn't have to listen to anybody before he makes a decision, invades a neighboring country, so forth. And that critique, of liberalism says, liberal societies are weak, they're indecisive, they don't set higher goals for themselves, and so forth. But I also think that there's a problem on the left, because one of the core values of a liberal society is tolerance and freedom of speech. And those principles have been under attack by a lot of progressives who, they claim that they want to protect diversity, but it's only a certain kind of diversity having to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, diversity in political opinions, diversity in attitudes towards religion or certain kinds of values. They don't they don't want to protect so much. And I think there you've seen also an attack on liberal values and institutions. And so I think both the left and the right have kind of converged in saying that liberalism is passé. That was the baby boom generation believed in that, but we want something different.
Yeah, and those are the key ideas in your book, Liberalism and Its Discontents. You define classical liberalism as rule of law and free media and checks and balances. And a lot of these institutions of democracy that America has benefited from over the last number of generations. And now those institutions are very much being threatened. And you characterize the threats as coming from both sides, but in different ways. And I thought that your book was in some ways an incredible summation of what a lot of people are thinking about, but didn't put it in as sophisticated language as you have. So let's retrace that argument a little bit. So
Sure.
where did the classical liberal tradition come from originally?
Well, it's very old. It really originated in the middle of the 17th century after Europe's wars of religion. Following the Protestant Reformation, Protestants and Catholics spent the next 150 years killing each other all over Europe over, questions like transubstantiation. Is the bread and wine the actual body of Christ or a representation of his blood and body? And at the end of that period, a lot of liberal thinkers said maybe we shouldn't be killing each other over these visions of the good life. Maybe we should just protect life itself. And so the right to life that is in the Declaration of Independence, really comes from that belief that it's basically just life itself that needs to be protected in a regime that tolerates a variety of visions of the good life. In the 19th and 20th centuries, instead of religion, it became nationalism. These very aggressive assertions of national identity that said that one group is superior to another group and could conquer other peoples and repress ethnic groups within their own society. Um, and again, in 1945, people said, well, maybe that's not such a great way to organize, at least Europe. Maybe we should have a liberal order in which tolerance and rule of law protects the rights of everybody, regardless of what group they're a member of. And so, it went wrong uh, at several points in history. And we come back to liberalism in the end because it is a way of managing diverse societies.
So you have these classical liberal traditions that arise in Europe and that America very much codifies in its founding documents, or at least tries to. I mean, like you characterize that look like our thinking has evolved certainly since since the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But the fundamentals, the foundations, have been in place really over that time, and now there is a breakdown in the confidence and faith in these institutions on both sides, but the attacks or misgivings are somewhat different on each side. So on the right side, you have this Trumpist populism is one version, but you also have conservatives who feel like their values are being threatened by what they see as activist institutions.
Yeah, it's a mixture of things. I think that many conservatives uh, really want a society in which there's more consensus over basic religious values. And so, the national conservatives now, these are the intellectuals that are trying to put this into a more theoretical framework, say that every society needs a dominant religious set of beliefs. And, in a way, liberalism arose because nobody could agree what that dominant set of values were. And, it's really kind of rolling the clock back several centuries to say that we are going to have, this one set of goals to which we're headed. But, that's one of the problems with a liberal society because it doesn't set these higher goals. People feel that there's kind of a lack in their life of a sense of community, a strong sense of community that'll bind them to their fellow citizens. And I think that's one of the things that's driving this. I think in the American context and in other European countries, there's something else, which is that there's a feeling that they personally are being devalued. They're not being respected. If you're kind of working class white guy that's lost his job over the last few years, or is working, flipping hamburgers instead of working in a steel plant or an auto factory, that person feels like the society doesn't value his labor the way it valued that of his father or his grandfather. And it's very easy in those circumstances to blame other people for that situation, particularly because in America right now, there are a lot of people who are doing really well. You go to Wall Street or you go to Stanford University, where I am, or Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of billionaires that have made a tremendous amount of money. And so I think a lot of the resentment has to do with that inequality that has emerged that give a lot of advantages to a certain class of people and their children, but really aren't extended to the whole of the society.
Guess what just came out on paperback? It's Forward, out on October 4th. You can buy it in any bookstore near you, and if you use the promo code YANG, you get absolutely nothing. This is your chance if you are waiting for a cheaper version of the book. It's out October 4th. Pre-order it. I really am proud of this book. It's something that you have to read to believe. All right, Forward, out on paperback. Thank you, everyone. So you have critiques and problems coming from the conservative side, where there's a group, let's call them white working class men, who feel like they're increasingly on the outside looking in for a host of reasons. And then there are critiques from the left that you catalog very interestingly. And one of the elements, and this is where it gets interesting, well, I mean, it's all interesting, but where liberalism is trying to have people in a diverse society say, look, we're not going to agree on everything, but let's agree that these institutions are here to mediate what happens to us. And I can believe one thing, you can believe another, but I can't impose my beliefs on you. Like that's for our institutions to sort out. And we should just agree that we'll submit ourselves to the rule of law and the judiciary and like whatever else the setup is. And then on the left now, increasingly, there's this dissatisfaction that's born of a new version of identity politics that has been the successor to the civil rights era identity politics, which you present as trying to live up to the promise of liberalism, where liberalism says, look, we all have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and there are certain groups that have been excluded from that for historical reasons. Let's say African Americans during the civil rights era movement saying we're on the outside looking in, so let's try and fix that. But then that critique has now morphed into something else, in part because of a series of academics who've made postmodernist arguments that have then coalesced into a contemporary version of identity politics that at least is prevalent in certain contexts.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that there's a liberal form of identity politics that says that people should be treated as individuals and judged as individuals, but the society looks at the color of their skin or their gender and treats them differently. And therefore, the liberal society never lives up to its promise of equal treatment. And therefore, what we want to do is just make that liberal society really live up to its own ideals. And that, I think, is fine. I don't see any complaint, that you can make about that as a liberal, because the fact of the matter is, as you alluded to in 1789, when the Constitution is ratified, the only people who could vote were white men with property, and so this equal, the human equality in the Declaration wasn't remotely the reality in the United States. And so that's a liberal version of identity politics, where identity is simply a tool for mobilization. But I think what's happened in a lot of contemporary societies, particularly in the US, is that people move on to say, well, actually, that fixed characteristic like your race or your gender is so important, and it's so essential that that's the most important thing that defines you as a human being and not who you are as an individual. And the society needs to treat you based on that group that you're a member of and not as an individual. And I think that's where it starts to undermine liberal principles because liberalism asserts the universal dignity of all human beings, not dependent on what group they're a member of, but simply because they're human beings. And as a practical matter, that means that a lot of progressives, will argue that just being white, means that you're in a position of permanent privilege, and because you can't really remediate that, you have to kind of reverse the hierarchy and privilege other people. And I think that's not the best way to organize a society.
Yeah, and that's something that I think people are struggling with right now, where you have a very legitimate. So I went to Brown University, and I was steeped in the civil rights era language that was then applied to other communities of color. Certainly, there's this idea of a civil rights movement that grows to encompass sexual orientation, Asians and Latinos, pretty much anyone who's in a marginalized group. And because our paradigm is very much around the civil rights era, everyone says, "Oh, like we should have a movement to try and achieve equality for each of these groups." So that's the way I was trained academically, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been an evolution since then, where now, instead of arguing for a particular policy, you are now saying that all of the institutions are so irredeemably racist or sexist that it's difficult to find like a policy that's being advocated for individually, which would be, in your sense, like a liberal thing to do, is to say, hey, look, like I can, like the institutions are not working, so let's argue it out institutionally. But now there's this other intellectual movement that's actually undermining liberal institutions by saying that the group is more important than the individual. I'm defined by the group I belong to, and these institutions are unable to actually reform themselves meaningfully.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, the argument that so critical theory has become a meaningless word because conservatives have picked it up as this big boogeyman, but it does have a serious intellectual history as a critique of liberalism. And many of the more serious versions of critical theory said basically that your society claims to be liberal, but it's actually kind of a facade, and that underneath that profession of equal treatment is actually the dominance of some groups by other groups, and that's the reality. It's really those hidden elites that are stacking the deck, using the language of equality, of liberal equality, to fool everybody into thinking that they live in a just society, but they're actually not. That it's a deeply unjust one, and you can't use liberal techniques to correct a structure that is stacked against these marginalized people. And that's the assertion that I find very questionable, because it does seem to me that in the history of liberal America, for example, we actually have made a lot of progress. I mean, there's a certain line that says, well, there's a continuity between slavery and lynching and Jim Crow and police violence. But honestly, if you asked an African American person, would you rather be a chattel slave in South Carolina, in 1830, or living today, despite all of the the plain inequalities that exist, which situation is better? And I just think that the progress that has been made towards those ideals is undeniable. But that doesn't mean that you then say, well, but everything's great, and let's not worry about existing injustices. What you do as a liberal is you say, yes, we're still not fully living up to those ideals, and so we need to go ahead and correct them. But our society is correctable, and we can use policy and politics to make changes to make things better.
And now, a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Here at Ford, we're all about solving problems, find the solution. But the fact is, sometimes our brains aren't really in a position to be productive and find the light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes things seem hopeless. Sometimes you just get really down. Your friends and family or the things you enjoy don't bring you the same enjoyment. And when you're in that state, you really could use some professional help. I saw a therapist for the first time when I was a teenager, and I've been a huge believer ever since. My brother works in mental health. If you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great way to do it. It's convenient, accessible, affordable, and entirely online. You can get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey and switch anytime. When you want your brain to solve problems, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/yang today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/yang. Yeah, and one of the underpinnings of classical liberalism, and you talk about how it's aligned with the scientific method, where you kind of assume a set of shared facts. And one of the major struggles we have is that at this point, it's tough for both sides to agree on facts. And certainly we can see that on the right, where there's, and you characterize it in the book interestingly. You say, look, there are people who genuinely believe the election's stolen. It's
Mm-hmm.
like that. Like they, for them, that's just what they think happened.
Right.
But that we have different version of facts that are arising, and that's something that unfortunately is starting to come up from both sides.
Yeah. So there's a complex background to all of this. Part of it has to do with again with critical theory. Actually, there's a view that appeared on the left in postmodernist thought that was probably best articulated by Michel Foucault, that said that science claims to be this objective approach to cognition that simply reflects objective reality, but in fact, it's something that's used by elites to manipulate people. And he said this with respect to homosexuality, incarceration, madness. All of these were categories that were basically used by hidden elites to keep people down. And honestly, in the cases that he cited, he did a lot of historical studies of the way that prisoners were incarcerated and the reasons for which they were incarcerated. And there's a lot to what he was saying. This is a way to hold down lower class people and keep them from making demands on the system. But he then generalized this to say that in general, science is really not objective. It's simply a tool that's used by powerful people to manipulate uh, others. And you can see now that that argument that begins on the left has now drifted over to the right. So you think about the coronavirus epidemic and the refusal to believe that public health authorities that were telling people to get vaccinated or to wear masks, people simply did not believe that that was based on science, that this was simply an effort by powerful people to manipulate and use that power to force others to bend to their will. And so now it's something that's shared on both sides of the spectrum. But I would say another really critical thing that happened in the interim is technology. Uh,
Yeah.
so indicating how old I am, when I was a kid in the 1960s, there were three television channels, broadcast TV channels, and you had to get all of your news pretty much from one of those three, and they were pretty much indistinguishable. But it also meant that there wasn't this possibility of having these radically different uh, views of reality. Whereas, with the rise of the internet, anyone can say anything, right? There's no necessary fact checking. There's no hierarchy of credible sources. and therefore, if you type in to Google, are mRNA vaccines safe? You'll get thousands of hits that will say, oh no, they're completely unsafe. This is really something terrible that's being done to you. And frankly, that's destroyed the possibility of having a common empirical base of knowledge. I mean, we agree in a liberal society that we're not going to agree on the highest things as defined by religion. But, if you don't agree who won the last election or should I, take a vaccine, then you're going to end up in a lot of trouble. And I think that's exactly where we are. So some of it is due to this skepticism and distrust of science, but it's also due to, I think, a technology that kind of flattens everything and sort of makes everything equal. Every fact is as good as every other fact, even if some of those facts are completely untrue.
Well, you'll be happy to know, Frank, I also remember when it was just three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then Fox was born, and The Simpsons came on our TVs, and it was the 80s. So I remember. And totally agree that social media and the proliferation of sources of information has now led to a splintering of the American consciousness. And it's tough to bring everyone back if you can't agree on facts. And that's one of the foundations of liberalism, is that we have to be able to stare at it and have facts that we can agree on. So you make a series of recommendations. First, you go through liberalism and then you say, hey, for all these critiques, is there a better way? And you argue, well, not really. I mean, we pretty much have to try and to stick to this.
Yeah.
So let's figure out what the path looks like. So one argument you make is that you don't want to base national identity around, for example, membership in one ethnic group or another, if you can help it, that if you can
Right.
invest in national identity in intelligent ways like that, that's worthwhile. I'm going to tell you a story about something. So it was during COVID, and I wanted to do something positive around Asian Americans and, like not beating us up. And so I helped start a campaign called All American, pretty much saying we're all Americans, we're all in this together. And there were people who actually found it problematic that I was both using American and the flag to denote diverse communities, or Asians in particular, because they actually thought that the phrase All American meant, let's say, Caucasian blonde people or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, the point is that I consider myself American and all American, and so should you. And it's like if we give up on that identity and the flag, and you wrote a book called Identity, so like you went in pretty deep on this. So I always felt like American encompasses all of us, and if we can invest in that meaningfully, that's a win. But I will say that I was kind of surprised. And I also felt like it was something generational, where I'm in my 40s. And so for me, like, it's like, yeah, sure, we're all American. But there were people who were younger who actually like chafed at the notion of using that term, all American or American or the flag, like on diverse communities.
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple of different sources of that. When I was young, I grew up in New York City, and there wasn't a large Japanese American, or indeed not that big an Asian, sub community in the city. And as I was growing, and then we moved to central Pennsylvania because my dad taught at Penn State, and that was an even more kind
Not a
of
ton of Asians in Central PA, huh, Frank?
no, yeah, and so I would get teased, by white kids and made fun of and so forth. And so I thought, and I'd ask my father, well, when people say, where are you from? What do I say? And he said, just say, I'm an American. And they say, well, but where did you come from? You say, I was born in Chicago. That's all you need to say, because an American doesn't denote a person of a certain race. It simply denotes somebody that has taken, that is a citizen that is loyal to the ideals of America, and you qualify. And I always thought that was a tremendous achievement, that I was living in a country where, coming from an Asian family, I could associate myself with the dominant, cultural group in the society and not feel embarrassed about that. And I think if you go to a naturalization ceremony, uh, anywhere in the country, it's an unbelievably moving experience because you get all these people from Korea, from Iran, from Guatemala, all over the world that take the oath of naturalization, and then at the end of it, they're declared Americans. And I just think that's such a big achievement. And there are very few countries where you can actually do that. You can't do that, in Germany or Sweden or a lot of European democracies where, the very adjective German or Swede or Japanese for that matter doesn't denote simply a citizen of that country. It denotes a member of the dominant ethnic group, right? So I think that that was a tremendous achievement of the United States. But now you're getting these people on the left that say, yeah, I don't want to be an American. I don't want to associate myself with that dominant group. I'm proud to be the member of this, small subgroup. And that's really who I care about because these are people like me. And I think that that basically takes them full circle to join hands with all the nationalists and racists that say that these kinds of characteristics are what are important and not your loyalty to a set of uh, liberal and democratic ideals that, for me, defined what it meant to be an American. And I think we're being dragged backwards both by these Neanderthal people on the right that still think of an American as being a white person, but also by people on the left that kind of accept that and say, yeah, we're different and we're proud of it and we're not going to, we don't want to associate with you.
Here at Forward, we think to protect your online privacy, you should use a virtual private network. ExpressVPN is the one that we recommend. I trust ExpressVPN because it gives me peace of mind that when I browse online, no one is tracking my data. No one can later figure out what the heck I did. It's fast, it's easy to use, it's just one button. It's literally so user-friendly that anybody can use it. And it's the highest rated VPN used by Fortune 500 companies, rated #1 by Business Insider, Verge, and many others. Don't take my word for it. Sign up today. Protect yourself with a VPN that so many people use and trust for their online privacy. Use my link expressvpn.com/yang today and get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/yang. Visit expressvpn.com/yang to learn more. So this is one of the things I wanted to discuss with you. There are a couple of big things. I mean, you've very effectively cataloged some of the dysfunctions of our institutions, and what in terms of the vitocracy, what we opened up with. And so I think that there's a lot of frustration and energy rising on both sides. What I'm doing now is hoping to modernize and advance some of our institutions so they're more genuinely responsive and representative and don't have this effective disenfranchisement and disempowerment of the vast majority of Americans, which I, by the way, totally believe is a huge part of this problem. And so you make
Right.
you make a series of recommendations. I feel like there are a couple of big directions we should be taking. One is to try and upgrade and modernize various institutions so that they are more responsive and accountable and proactive, because right now there's so many of us who just look up and say like, do I believe in these institutions? And as you say, the mistrust is rising, like the trust is declining fast. And so the response right now, in my opinion, is not a genuine upgrading of most of these institutions. Is trying to talk about them better. It's like the institutions, then it's like, oh, we just need to invest in better social media accounts and then people will trust us more. and, like, I don't think that's the answer. Right. So like we have to try and upgrade them. But you also make a series of recommendations around, and I'll talk about one that's hugely important, where you compare the conservatives in America to the conservatives in the UK, and the conservatives in the UK decided to expand the franchise and say, look, our ideas will win with people of different backgrounds. And by the way, I think this would work in the U.S. in many ways, because you can see, for example, more Latinos heading to the
Right.
Republican Party, and like more people. I will say too, there's some fed up Asians that are heading that direction too, and
Right.
so
Right.
you could compete and expand the franchise. The dark path, the path they're taking, is to try and curb voter participation and make it harder and say, hey, even though we're a declining number, we're going to maintain control by trying to just make it tougher. And you argue very convincingly that, look, like there actually is a better path that's better for democracy itself and liberal institutions that might actually work better for that group. Now, I'm not optimistic that they'll take your advice, but I thought it was a very
No.
compelling argument.
No, I mean, I think the MAGA Republicans are painting themselves into a corner where they're saying, we're not going to create this big tent, we're not inviting a lot of people in, but because they are not a majority of the country, it means that they're going to keep losing elections unless they start manipulating those elections or, pushing for non-democratic outcomes. And that's, not a good formula. It's a formula for a lot of civil strife,
Yep.
and ultimately, I think it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt them. The 19th century British conservative approach really was the one that was taken by Benjamin Disraeli, who pushed the Second Reform Bill that opened up the franchise to a lot of working class British people, and it turned out that they could be motivated by patriotism, by certain pride in their national institutions, and that was the basis for their dominance of British politics really up until the early 20th century. And I think the Republicans had been on that path under Reagan. Reagan did not have an ethnic understanding of who is an American. He was, happy, content with immigration, accepting other people that wanted to join the American family. He was open to the world and internationalist, and so forth. And that, it seems to me, is a very, powerful formula. But right now, that's not where much of the Republican Party is, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I'm pessimistic that they're going to take your advice, but I thought it was a very, very useful historical example. You also discuss allowing communities to make more decisions for themselves and not nationalizing and making everything the decision of the federal government, which I thought was very,
Right.
very interesting. I mean, that's also very aligned with a lot of what we're doing with Forward. Is we're trying to go to communities and give people more choice in local races, because now a majority, maybe up to 70% of races are uncontested or uncompetitive. And so people don't have any meaningful choice. I was
Right.
just in Missouri in a district that's this great, great woman was looking at running. I'd say her name, but I don't want to put pressure on her decision to run. But she was running in a district that's 60-40 Republican. And if you were a Democrat, it's a waste of time because you're going to lose. And so she's hoping to run as Forward Party in that district. And she's a civil engineer. She's kind of a rational, middle of the road type. And her argument is, look, like I want to run as Forward Party because I think I could get all the Dems as long as they didn't run anyone themselves. And then I think I could get 20% of the Republicans because a lot of them are like me. And so that's her plan. And that's something that hopefully we can help her with in Missouri. But that's our hope in a lot of districts around the country, so that you could actually get people in position where they could make a difference in their town, in their school district, in their county, like whatever the unit of government is. So that's a lot of what the Forward Party is driving towards. There are people that would be very upset about that approach in terms of saying, look, we should stop federalizing every issue. But I think that what you were saying is really important, that maybe we should let communities decide more of these things.
Yeah, I think that in American constitutional history, there's certain issues that should be decentralized in decision making and given to local communities, but there's others that you can't do that with. And so the prime example of the latter had to do with slavery, right? That
Yep.
before the Civil War, people in the South said, well, that should be up to local communities to And if we want that institution, we should be allowed to decide democratically to have it. And it was Abraham Lincoln that said in his debate with Stephen Douglas, no, that's not true. Not everything can be decided by a local democratic majority. There are some things that are a matter of principle, like the equality of all human beings that's enshrined in our Declaration of Independence. And therefore, that has to be taken out of the realm of democratic choice because that's a fundamental value. But, a question of, do we spend our money on a road, or do we buy a sports stadium, or do we, do something else with the local tax dollars? There's really no reason why that shouldn't be made by the local community. And so, if you exempt a certain category of fundamental rights, based issues, then I think absolutely you should give communities uh, the opportunity to make their own decisions. And with regard to something like healthcare, maybe you do need certain national minimal standards for if you're going to have a national healthcare system. But there's probably some virtue to having states implement it, as they see fit. It may mean that not everybody gets treated uniformly, but I think that you know, as long as you are providing the basic, healthcare, the actual detailed way in which it's done, could probably be left up to localities.
So if you buy, and I think you do, that this argument that, look, these institutions, we need to try and resuscitate them because this is the best system we have, the best hope we have. What are reforms that you're excited about, to the extent that you think that there does need to be some kind of rejuvenation of some of these mechanisms, because they are overrun by corporate influence, as you've pointed out, that there are a lot of choke points. It's very hard for a lot of Americans to recover faith and confidence that these institutions are going to suddenly get up and throw off all of like the fetters. And there are different people that are mad for different reasons. Like some might be like, "Hey, why can't we address climate change?" Others might be angry about
Right.
something we do. There's as you note in your book, there's such rampant mistrust that at this point everyone's mad about potential overreach. So you have these overlapping concerns where everyone's upset.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes in your book is you said, "Look, it's not about the size of the state; it's about its quality. Like the quality is much more important. What can we do that would make the state actually better? Like, what are your top hopes for what we can
Well,
do?"
yeah, there's several different answers to that question. The first has to do with institutional changes that will reduce polarization. So, with with respect to your prospects for the Forward Party, the most important of them is changing the voting system,
Amen.
because
Let's go.
unless you move to ranked choice voting, or better yet, proportional representation, then I think third parties really have a really hard time getting any traction. So that's one thing. I think you could limit the terms of Supreme Court justices so that
Sure.
you don't have these huge stakes of appointing somebody that's going to be on the bench for the next 40 years. You could limit it to 18, or even a shorter length of time. You could get rid of the filibuster. I'm not sure I'd take it all the way down to 50 in the Senate, but if you simply reduced it to 55, it would be a little bit counter majoritarian, um, but it wouldn't block things as much as they're blocked under the current system. If you only needed a small handful of senators from the other party to agree, so those are some things that could be done. Now, in terms of actually making the government more effective, I think that uh, we really need to reform the civil service, particularly the federal civil service. I know that a lot of Republicans think that that's the deep state, and they're actually out to destroy the civil service. The Trump administration, right before the election, issued this executive order on creating a Schedule F that basically would eliminate all protections for federal civil servants and allow them to fire whoever they wanted. And I think that we actually need to move in the other direction to improve the professionalism and the nonpartisan, impersonal character of our civil service. Right now, for just to give you one small example, something like only 4% of federal bureaucrats are under the age of 30. And if you're talking about a government that's savvy about technology and understands and is comfortable with using technology, I think you're going to need a few more 20-year-olds,
Yeah, I'd
in
say
that
so.
mix. In fact, I mean, the average age of federal bureaucrats is it's been close to retirement age for some time. Um, and I think that in general, you need to actually reduce the number of political appointees. There's like 4 to 5,000 that we have to appoint with every change of administration, and it excessively politicizes the civil service. It means that a lot of positions remain vacant, sometimes for years at a time. And I think we also need to change the incentives. I mean, both positive and negative. You have to be able to reward people that are good performers or have skills that are very specialized. In Canada, part in the finance ministry there, they have an office that oversees public-private partnerships, which are very complicated approaches to infrastructure. And the guy that runs that office, was recruited off of Wall Street, and he's paid $1 million Canadian, which in American dollars is still a lot of money. But they say, well, that's how you have to pay somebody with that kind of skill. Whereas we've got a classification system that's 70 years old.
Oh
It's really
gosh,
designed.
it's such a
It's designed for
disaster.
a yeah. It's
It,
designed for a government of clerks and typists.
yeah, it's slow, cumbersome, makes it very, very difficult to recruit people who have, frankly, the ability to command high salaries in the private sector. Where anyone who goes into it then has to do it for such like this sense of altruism and purpose.
Yeah.
But even then, the speed is so slow that even if they want to do it, they're like, I can't wait 6, 12 months for a decision on
No, that's right. No,
whether
the
I'm heading there.
compliance requirements for getting a job in the federal bureaucracy are just ridiculous. I now once again have a security clearance because I'm a trustee of the RAND Corporation that does classified research, and even there, they want to know every foreign national I've met in the last 7 years. Now
You've been
I
around, man. You
teach,
probably met a lot of foreign nationals.
yeah, I mean, that's like hundreds and hundreds of people, and I can't possibly remember all the people I've met over that period. So anyhow, there's lots of things like that that really stand in the way, and I see this in my students. Hardly any of them.
You mean your Stanford students are not all clamoring to go work for the government?
No, no. No, I mean the ones that are actually more public spirited, they want to go to work for an NGO or for an
Sure.
international organization, but they don't want to go into the federal government. And
I
you
mean,
can
I
sort of
shouldn't
see
laugh. Like we
why.
wish they would, but the fact is, if
Yeah,
they did go right now, like some of them might cycle out after a certain period because they're
yeah,
not really doing the kind of work they want or not having the kind of impact they want. I mean, that's a problem too.
yeah. They're not being rewarded really for good performance, and so there's a lot
Especially
of
if they're
things I
watching
think.
their classmates like advance and make money and do all this stuff. They're like, because the government's not in the habit of rewarding uh, superstars or exceptional performers.
Yeah, I mean there is some effort to do that. The Partnership for Public Service, which is really the premier organization that kind of looks out for public servants, has this annual award called I think it's the Samuel J. Hyman Awards or the Sammys, in which they look for exceptional civil servants, public servants, and give them at least some recognition. Not a lot of money, but recognition. And the stories are just incredible. Michael Lewis actually wrote. He's written a couple of books about this, but he wrote this book, The Fifth Risk, about some of the extraordinary people that actually worked for the federal government. And nobody knows about these people. I mean, there's
Yeah, it's
just this
very thankless,
prejudice.
somewhat anonymous, etc. I mean, if there's something we could do
Yeah.
to help elevate their profile, it'd be awesome. So you close your book with an appeal for moderation, which I thought was very, very, very appropriate. And you talked about how it was one of the original virtues, and I would say too that that call is also very, very aligned with some of the work we're doing. And I'm going to suggest to you, Frank, that there is, I don't know, have you seen the comedian Ronnie Chang?
No.
Well, you should check him out. But he had a joke that people quoted to me sometimes when I was running for president. But he said that that America needs Asians to be the referee because we and his joke was, we don't have any skin in the game because we can't make your sports teams. That we're here to referee the race war. What was his argument? But there was, as usual in humor, like that there was some, truth to it, in the sense that Asian Americans tend to be a little bit less ideological, a little bit more pragmatic and practical, and interested in what's working and what's not working. And right now, the two parties are having increasingly ideological conversations that don't seem to be focused on, people just trying to live better lives. So the fact that you appealed for moderation at the end of your book, I thought was very powerful and appropriate.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of our problems have to do with the fact that if we say that something's good, then 10 times as much is going to be 10 times as good. So markets are basically a good way, to allocate scarce resources. But that doesn't mean that, if you marketize everything, that you're going to have a even better society. And I think that's kind of
indeed,
the problem with, with the kind of neoliberal policies that we pursued, in the 80s and 90s. Same thing with autonomy. Autonomy is basic to liberalism. We all want to be able to make choices, but that doesn't mean that we should make choices about everything. That we get to make up our own morality, and we get to decide on our own what's good and bad, because it's really that common shared value that gives us a sense of community. And so, in all of those cases, being a little bit moderate in something's a good thing, but maybe too much of it is a bad thing. Maybe a little sense of moderation in that respect would be helpful for all of us.
Well, that's a phenomenal note to close on. I will say, when you talk about our economic system, I can't tell you how many times I got annoyed when people tried to set up this false capitalism, socialism dichotomy. And you're like, look, what we need is actually like intelligent regulatory approaches that kind of curb the excesses of unfettered capitalism. And most Americans could agree that, it's like there's going to be some kind of intelligent middle ground. But folks had these very, very, in my mind, just unproductive, not very smart, oh, that's socialism, that's capitalism. It's like, come on, there's always something practical and pragmatic that you can find in the middle, generally speaking, about a lot of these topics. And I thought that, your book made a fantastic argument for that in many different respects. Frank, thank you so much for joining us. Liberalism and Its Discontents by Francis Fukuyama, one of his 10 books. So, this one is the one I focused on because I thought it was, well, one is the most recent, and two, I thought it was the most up forwards alley. but you contributed a whole lot to wisdom and political discourse over the last, not to date you, my friend, but decades. So congratulations for that, and keep on making us smarter and wiser, and hopefully more liberal in the classical sense.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Andrew, and good luck to you and all your efforts too.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, we're just getting started. Really, America, more liberal in a classical sense. That most people won't get what we're going for there, but some will.
Okay, very good.